The sun beat down on the Magnus Arena like a physical weight, turning the white marble tiers into a blinding furnace. 50,000 voices had been reduced to a low, rhythmic thrumming, the sound of a city waiting for a kill. Hey friends, welcome. I'm Marcus. Another incredible gladiator story for you today. This isn't just a story about blood and sand, it's about the cost of a human soul. Let me know where you're watching from and please hit that subscribe button. Let's get started. In the center of the pit, the man they called Kalo, the ghost of the pit, stood motionless. Kalo was a legend written in scar tissue. He had survived 10 years in the arena, a feat that defied all statistics. He had outlived 3 emperors and hundreds of fellow slaves. His body was a map of Rome's expansion, a jagged line from a Thracian blade across his chest, a burn from a Persian fire pot on his shoulder, and the deep, knotted scars on his wrists where the chains had never truly let go. Today was his 50th victory. Before him lay the broken body of Golgotha, a mountain of a man from the northern wilds whom the emperor had dubbed the Unstoppable. Kalo's final strike had been a masterpiece of economy, a single, precise thrust of his gladius into the small gap between the giant's helmet and breastplate. Now, as the sand drank the giant's lifeblood, Kalo didn't celebrate. He simply looked up at the royal box. Emperor Aurelius rose from his throne. Aurelius was a man who thrived on theatrics. He was young, arrogant, and obsessed with his own legacy as a merciful deity. He signaled for silence, and the crowd obeyed instantly. Kalo. Aurelius's voice echoed off the stone walls. Today, you have achieved what no man in our history has done. 50 victories. The gods themselves must be tired of watching you win. Aurelius reached for a velvet cushion held by a trembling servant. On it lay the Rudis, a beautifully carved wooden sword. To any other gladiator, it was the most precious object in the world. Step forward, ghost, the emperor commanded. Kneel, and accept your freedom. By my word, you are no longer a slave. You are a citizen of Rome. Go, and live the rest of your days in the peace you have earned with your steel. Kalo walked slowly toward the box. His boots crunched on the blood-slicked sand. The Praetorian guards, clad in gleaming black armor, tensed as he approached. Kalo stopped 10 paces from the emperor. He didn't kneel. I do not want the wooden sword, Caesar, Kalo said. His voice was rasping, like stones grinding together, but it carried to the highest rows. The crowd gasped. A ripple of confusion and mounting dread swept through the stands. Aurelius's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. You do not want freedom. Perhaps you want gold. A villa on the coast. Name your price, champion. I invoke the law of the request, Kalo replied. The emperor's face went pale. The law of the request was an ancient, nearly forgotten decree from the founding of the city, a ritual meant to prove the emperor's humility. It stated that a champion of 50 games could forego his freedom to make one single request of the crown that must be granted, provided it did not involve the death of the emperor. What is your request? Aurelius asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Kalo pointed his blood-stained finger directly at the golden throne. I want to be emperor, Kalo declared. For 12 hours. From tomorrow's dawn until the setting of the sun, I shall wear the purple, sit upon the throne, and hold the seal of Rome. And you, Aurelius, you shall take my place. You will be chained in the gladiator's barracks, you will eat the slop of the pits, and you will wait for the sunset as a slave. The silence that followed was so absolute it was terrifying. The Praetorians drew their swords. The crowd sat frozen. It was a request for total sacrilege. Aurelius looked at the thousands of expectant faces. He saw the shift in the atmosphere. If he refused, he was a coward who feared his own laws. If he accepted, he was handing the world to a man who had every reason to want him dead. I accept, Aurelius said, a cold, manic light dancing in his eyes. Rome loves a spectacle. Let us see how the ghost rules the world, and how a god handles the chains. The sun crept over the horizon, painting the marble columns of the Palatine Hill in shades of bruised violet and burning orange. The transition was silent. witnessed only by the high-ranking officers of the Praetorian Guard and the chief priests of the temple, Aurelius, stripped of his silk tunics and gold-leafed laurel, stood in the center of the imperial bedchamber. For the first time in his life, he was naked and vulnerable. Two gladiator handlers, their faces masked to avoid future execution, stepped forward. They didn't use the gentle touch of a servant, they grabbed his arms with calloused hands, snapping heavy, rusted iron manacles around his wrists and ankles. The cold bite of the metal made the emperor flinch, a sensation he had only ever seen others endure. Across from him, Kalo sat on the edge of the massive, cedarwood bed. He had been scrubbed clean, his salt and pepper hair trimmed, and his rugged face shaved. But the scars remained, vivid, angry lines of history that clashed with the softness of the imperial purple. When the servants draped the heavy, gold-fringed cloak over his shoulders, Kalo didn't move. He felt the weight of it, but unlike Aurelius, he didn't lean into the luxury. He felt like a soldier putting on a heavy pack for a long march. "Remember," Aurelius hissed, his voice trembling as he was led toward the secret servant's staircase. "The sun will set, ghost. And when it does, I will spend the rest of eternity inventing new ways for you to die." Kalo didn't look at him. He adjusted the signet ring of Rome on his finger. "Then make sure you survive the morning, Caesar. The pits are less forgiving than a throne." The morning began with a shock that rippled through the heart of the Senate. The doors to the Curia Julia swung open, and instead of the graceful, arrogant stride of Aurelius, a Titan entered. Kalo walked with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a man used to wearing armor. He didn't wear the crown, he carried it in his hand like a weapon. The senators, men of ancient lineages and vast wealth, sat in stunned silence. They had heard the rumors from the arena, but the sight of a slave sitting on the ivory throne was a blasphemy they couldn't process. Kalo sat. He looked at the assembly, his icy blue eyes scanning the room with the predatory focus of a gladiator measuring his opponent's weaknesses. "The emperor is occupied," Kalo said, his voice deep and gravelly, echoing in the high-domed chamber. "For today, his seal is mine. His word is mine. His justice is mine. This is an outrage." Senator Varro, a man whose family had advised kings for generations, stood up. "You are a beast of the sand. You cannot dictate the laws of Rome." Kalo didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply looked at the captain of the Praetorians, a man named Cassius who stood behind the throne. "Captain," Kalo said. "What is the penalty for interrupting the emperor in his own house?" Cassius hesitated, then spoke, "Flaying, sire." "Or the salt mines," Kalo turned back to Varro. "Sit down, Senator. Before I decide that Rome's salt supply is running low." Varro sat, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Kalo leaned forward. He didn't ask for a feast or a parade. He didn't ask for wine or women. He pulled a small, crumpled piece of parchment from his belt, the only thing he had brought from the barracks. "Bring me the ledger of the 3rd Legion," Kalo commanded. "And the records of the grain tax from the northern provinces, specifically the years of the Great Famine." "Now," the senators whispered frantically. Why would a gladiator care about grain taxes and old military records? But the soldiers moved. In the presence of the signet ring, they had no choice. While Kalo was digging into the dark administrative secrets of the empire, Aurelius was discovering the reality of the machine he had built. The gladiator barracks, known as the Rudis, were a hell of damp stone and the smell of fear. Aurelius was thrown into a communal cell with 20 other men. These weren't the champions seen in the arena, these were the fodder, men destined to die in the opening acts to warm up the crowd. The lanista, a man named Rufus who had a face like a crushed walnut, walked along the bars, dragging a wooden cane across the iron. "Wake up, you dogs!" Rufus roared. "We've got a special guest today. The new 50. He thinks he's a god." Rufus stopped in front of Aurelius. The emperor was huddled in the corner, his skin crawling from the filth on the floor. "Well, stand up, number 50. Rufus barked, "Do you know who I am?" Aurelius whispered, his voice cracking. "I am your sovereign. If you touch me, your family will be erased from history." Rufus laughed, a dry, hacking sound. He opened the gate, stepped inside, and delivered a swift, brutal kick to Aurelius's ribs. The emperor collapsed, gasping for air, the taste of copper filling his mouth. "In here," Rufus leaned down, his breath smelling of sour wine and rot. "You are just meat. And if you don't pick up that wooden practice sword and show me you can at least die with some dignity, I'll feed your sovereign ass to the lions before noon. Now, get to the yard." Aurelius was dragged out into the training circle. He was handed a heavy wooden sword that felt like lead in his uncalloused hands. Across from him stood a massive Gaul, a man who had lost his eye in his last fight. The Gaul looked at Aurelius's soft skin and manicured fingernails and smiled a toothless, hungry smile. For 3 hours, the emperor was beaten. Not to death, but to the edge of it. Every time he fell, the whip of the trainer brought him back up. He learned the rhythm of the slave's life, the dust in the lungs, the salt of sweat in open wounds, and the absolute, terrifying indifference of the world to your suffering. Back in the palace, the sun reached its zenith. Calo had turned the imperial library into a war room. He had summoned the imperial treasurer and the head of the secret police. "You've been stealing," Calo said, tossing a ledger onto the table. "Sire, those are complex accounts," the treasurer began. "I've spent 10 years counting the seconds between life and death," Calo interrupted, standing up and looming over the man. "I know when someone is hedging their bets. You didn't just tax the northern provinces, you starved them. You reported the grain as lost to rot, but the shipping manifests say it went to your private granaries in Sicily." Calo turned to the head of the secret police. "And you? You knew. You took 10% to keep the emperor from finding out." "The emperor wouldn't have cared anyway," the officer spat, his eyes defiant. "He only cares about the games." "I care," Calo said. He took the imperial seal and pressed it onto a new decree. "As of this moment, the Sicilian granaries are seized. The grain is to be moved back north immediately. And the treasurer? He's going to the pits. He likes the games so much, let's see how he likes being part of the entertainment." The guards moved to arrest the man. Calo watched him go, his face impassive. But his hand was shaking slightly. He wasn't just fixing a tax problem. He was looking for something specific. A name he hadn't seen yet. He turned back to the scrolls. He searched until his fingers were stained with ink. Finally, he found it. A list of political prisoners from 10 years ago, the year the Third Legion was purged for a supposed coup. He found the name, Lucilla of the Third. Calo's breath hitched. He looked at the captain of the guard. "This woman. Where is she held?" Cassius looked at the scroll and paled. "The island of Scorpions, sire. But, she was sentenced to the slow death. No one survives 10 years there." "Then we are going to find out if she's a ghost too," Calo said. But as he stood up to give the order, the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon. The 12 hours were slipping away. And in the distance, the sound of a horn echoed, the signal that the evening games were about to begin. The most dangerous part of Calo's request was about to unfold. He had used the law to help the people, but he hadn't yet dealt with the man in the chains. Calo looked at the crown. He didn't put it on. He grabbed his old gladiator's belt, hidden under the purple silk, and tightened it. "Captain," Calo said. "Prepare the arena. The emperor is coming home. And he's going to want his throne back." The sky above Rome was no longer blue, it had bruised into a deep, bleeding violet, streaked with veins of gold. It was the color of an empire in transition. The shadow of the great sundial in the forum crept toward the final mark. The moment Calo's 12-hour reign would expire, Calo stood on the balcony of the imperial palace, looking down at the city he had ruled for half a day. In his hand, he held the signet ring, its gold surface cold against his scarred skin. He had done more in 12 hours than most emperors did in a decade. He had emptied the corrupt granaries, signed the death warrants of 3 treacherous ministers, and diverted the wealth of the Sicilian estates to the starving provinces of the north. But there was one final task: is the messenger back? Kalo asked, his voice steady despite the exhaustion clawing at his bones. Captain Cassius stepped out of the shadows. He looked at Kalo with a new kind of respect, not the fearful obedience he gave to Aurelius, but the silent reverence a soldier gives to a commander who leads from the front. The bird arrived from the coast, sire, Cassius whispered. The rescue party reached the island of Scorpions. They found her. Lucilla, she is alive. Barely. They are transporting her to a villa in the mountains. By the time Aurelius realizes she is gone, she will be beyond his reach. Kalo closed his eyes for a brief second. A weight he had carried for 10 years, the guilt of a failed rebellion. The memory of his wife being dragged away while he was sold into the pits, finally began to lift. Good, Kalo said. He handed the signet ring to Cassius. Take this. Use the remaining minutes to sign the manumission papers for the 500 gladiators in the Ludus Magnus. Do it now, before the sun touches the horizon, sire. If I do that, Aurelius will have my head the moment he returns, Cassius said, his voice trembling. He might, Kalo replied, looking the captain in the eye. But you will die a man who freed 500 souls. Isn't that better than living as a dog for a tyrant? Cassius looked at the ring, then at Kalo. He bowed low, took the seal, and sprinted toward the chancellery. The final spectacle, the Magnus Arena, was packed. It was the evening of the eclipse, the final event Kalo had ordered. The crowd was hushed, sensing the electricity in the air. This wasn't just a game, it was the conclusion of the most insane gamble in history. Kalo entered the royal box. He didn't wear the emperor's robes anymore. He had returned to his roots, leather subligaria, a simple iron spalder on his shoulder, and a heavy, unadorned sword at his hip. He sat on the throne, his presence commanding more attention than any crown ever could. Bring him out, Kalo commanded. From the gate of the Porta Libitina, the gate of death, emerged Aurelius. The emperor was unrecognizable. He was covered in the filth of the barracks. His face was swollen, his ribs were black and blue, and he limped heavily. In his hand, he clutched a blunt practice sword. He looked up at the royal box, his eyes wide with a manic, vengeful hatred. The crowd didn't cheer. They watched in a terrifying, clinical silence. They saw their god as a beaten animal. Kalo stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony, looking down into the pit. Aurelius. Kalo's voice boomed. The sun is setting. In 10 minutes, you will be Caesar again. You will have your palace, your wine, and your power. Aurelius spat blood onto the sand. I will have your skin, he shrieked. I will burn every village you ever touched. I will make Rome forget you were ever born. Perhaps, Kalo said calmly. But for 10 years, you watched us from up here. You laughed while we bled. You made our deaths a joke. I wanted you to know, just for one day, what it feels like to be meat. I wanted you to feel the cold of the iron and the weight of the whip. Kalo stepped over the railing and jumped. He landed on the sand with a heavy thud, 30 feet below. He stood up, unhurt, and drew his sword. The law says I must return the empire to you at sunset, Kalo said, his blade humming as it cut the air. But it doesn't say I can't give you one last lesson. Aurelius backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The time, look at the sun. It's touching the hills. You can't touch me. I am Caesar. The sun hasn't set yet, Kalo said. He moved like a blur. Despite his age and his wounds, Kalo was a master of the arena. He didn't strike to kill. He struck with the flat of his blade, a humiliating, stinging blow across Aurelius's thigh. Then another across his shoulder. Aurelius screamed, swinging his wooden sword wildly, but he was fighting a shadow. Kalo disarmed him with a flick of his wrist, sending the wooden sword flying into the stands. Kalo grabbed the emperor by the throat and slammed him into the stone wall of the arena. Look at them, Kalo hissed, gesturing to the 50,000 people in the stands. They aren't cheering for you. They aren't even afraid of you anymore. They've seen you bleed. They've seen you cry. You can take the throne back, but you can never take back the dignity you lost in the dirt today. the last sliver of the sun dipped behind the western hills, the trumpet sounded, the long, low blast of the bucina. The 12 hours were over, the setting of the sun, silence fell over the arena. The Praetorian guards, who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped onto the sand. They didn't move toward Calo. They moved toward Aurelius. Calo let go of the emperor's throat. He sheathed his sword and stood back, his arms at his sides. Aurelius slumped against the wall, gasping for air. He looked at the guards. "Kill him," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Kill him now. I am your emperor. I command it." Captain Cassius stepped forward. He looked at Aurelius, the broken, sobbing man in the dirt. Then he looked at Calo, who stood tall, a man who had accepted his fate. Cassius reached into his cloak and pulled out a scroll. "Your Majesty," he said to Aurelius, "the orders signed by the Emperor Calo before the sunset are legally binding for 24 hours after the transition. The 500 gladiators of Rome are now free men. The grain has been moved. The treasury is empty." Aurelius let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I don't care. Kill him. I want his head on a pike." Cassius turned to Calo. There was a profound sadness in the captain's eyes. "By the law of the empire, for the crime of high treason and the theft of the imperial person. Calo of the pits is sentenced to death." Calo nodded. He didn't struggle. He didn't plead. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to blink through the purple haze. "Do it," Calo said softly. "But remember the lesson, Captain. The crown is just a hat. The man is what matters." The guards surrounded Calo. But as they led him toward the center of the arena for the execution, something happened that no one expected. A single gladiator in the stands, one of the men Calo had just freed, stood up. He slammed his fist against his chest in a silent salute. Then another stood. Then another. Within seconds, 500 free men were standing in the stands, their fists echoing like a drumbeat against their chests. Thump. 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 The crowd of citizens joined in. The sound grew until the entire stadium was vibrating with the rhythm of the ghost's heartbeat. Aurelius scrambled to his feet, trying to reclaim his majesty. "Stop it. I am the sun. I am Rome." But no one was looking at him. Calo knelt in the sand. He looked at Cassius. "One request, Captain. Not as an emperor. As a man, anything." Cassius whispered, "Tell Lucilla." "I found her," Calo said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Tell her the ghost is finally going home." Cassius raised his sword. The blade caught the last dying light of the day. Shink. Epilogue. The ghost's legacy. History says that Emperor Aurelius was assassinated 3 months later by his own Praetorian guard. They say he died in the same barracks where he had spent those 12 hours, screaming that he was a god while the men he had once owned looked on with indifference. But the story of Calo didn't end in the sand. In the northern provinces, the ghost's grain saved 100,000 lives. In a small villa in the mountains, a woman named Lucilla lived out her days in peace, watching the sunset every evening and remembering the man who had traded the world for 12 hours of justice. And in the Magnus Arena, for centuries after, the gladiators would gather before a fight. They wouldn't pray to the emperor. They would kneel in the center of the pit, touch the sand, and whisper a single name, the man who showed them that even a slave can rule, and even a king can bleed. The impossible request was fulfilled. Not with a crown, but with a legacy that no tyrant could ever execute.